Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable and pleasing in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. One issue that keeps me up at night is racial policy. I know that I wouldn't be here today if South Africa hadn't enforced affirmative action policy that ensured Black people and people of color are hired and supported to thrive. This is one of many stories that drive my passion and commitment to racial justice and equity. Over the past 2 months, we have heard many such stories from many of you. The Greater Boston Interfaith Organization has invited their member congregations to embark on listening sessions where we have been asking people to share their justice concerns, as well as stories in their lives that have impacted the issues they care the most about. These concerns shared will feed into GBIO's focus areas for the coming year. One strong correlation was that for most people, the issues they care deeply about today are connected to their own personal experiences or those of someone dear to them. This tells us that our stories matter in knowing and understanding ourselves and each other, in responding to our individual and collective sense of call, and how we might need to move in this world. We know, too, in this past year, that it is in hearing the horrific stories of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Nina Pop, the stories of violent discrimination towards people of Asian descent, the stories of displacement and discrimination of Palestinians, that action and organizing began to take place. Stories that we all know have been ongoing for years and years, and yet it was only in their sharing and retelling at scale that people could be held accountable. This is what is made possible when we share and listen to each other's stories. In today's passage, we hear about Isaiah's vision and call story. The glory of God, the voice of God, shakes things up. Isaiah, in despair, cries out for himself and his community. And God responds with a question. Whom shall I send? Will you go for us? And to this Isaiah responds, Here I am, send me. We hear very similar responses in the call stories of Abraham, Jacob, Moses, Samuel. But in this story in particular, Isaiah isn't called explicitly, but instead chooses or volunteers himself. And sometimes this is how our calls unfold. We put our hands up. In Isaiah's vision, we see God sitting on a throne. We hear the calling of the seraphs. He smells the smoke. He feels the shaking of the temple. He tastes the live coal. Isaiah's vision is all-consuming and embodiment of all of who he is. And this is the very vision that led him to saying yes to a call from God. Sometimes our visions can feel this way, too grand, too unrealistic, surreal. And this might lead us to ask ourselves, do we even have the courage to articulate our visions and say yes to our call? Responding to our visions, to our call, can be difficult and hard. Very soon after Isaiah's eager yes, we start to experience his uncertainty about a decision he made with haste. We feel his anxiety about doing this divine work. He now sounds very different, faced with the reality of what the hands and feet of call look like. In place of the words, "Here I am, send me," we now hear him crying out, questioning, "How long, O God?" And perhaps wondering if God could have asked someone else instead. Doesn't that happen to us sometimes when there's a call to action and we so eagerly and readily step up? Then the reality of the work sets in. We are still called and are now navigating the day-to-day realities of call. And sometimes, the more we come to understand what this yes means, we want out. For us, this could look like saying yes to racial injustice, and yet the realities of unlearning, of writing emails and making phone calls to governors, of changing where we bank and buy, of altering our conversations with our friends and families, of acknowledging our confusion and not knowing, can feel tedious for some. We too can find ourselves crying out, "How long, O God, how long?" Despite this outcry in the hardship and working out of our call, after Isaiah expressed his and his community's despair, he can now hear God. And God listens to his despair and invites him to do something. And this is the power of expressing our despair, of crying out, of sharing about our deep societal concerns. We can be listened to, and change can happen. And reflecting back on the listening sessions we had, some people said there was something very meaningful about knowing that the stories and issues that people shared will be heard and taken to heart to affect change. Sharing our stories and the things that matter most to us is a deeply vulnerable action. We are telling people something important, meaningful about us. Our personal stories are important, and sharing and understanding them gives us a sense of who we are and tells us about our call. Our stories are an important way to know ourselves and others. They help us to articulate and share in our individual and collective visions. And in sharing, we are reminded that we don't have to carry the weight of our visions and callings alone. Someone in one of the listening sessions said, in others bearing witness, in hearing another's pain and truths, it brings closeness and compassion. It reminds us that we are interconnected and that we are not free until we are all free. In our day today, we are wrestling with answering God's call for our time. We have been discerning and hearing the voice of God to listen for the story that God is co-creating with us to create a more just world. This process of storying is what allows us to begin to imagine and live into an alternate and new reality. And these are some of the issues we have heard are of great importance to you. Climate justice, equity and access in healthcare, access to quality education, police reform, immigration, and so many more. And many of them intersect with racial justice. Howard Thurman says, don't ask yourself what the world needs. Ask yourself what makes you come alive, and then go do that. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive. In our listening sessions, I can certainly attest to the stories that people shared that make them come alive. When we take a look at the intersection of our stories, our call, our passions, our talents, our sense of purpose, we find life. We come alive. Jackie Lewis says core stories, as varied and as many as they are stories of intersection, the intersection of God's care for and reconciliation of the world, and our individual and collective sense of being and purpose. As we listen, hear, share our stories, we are co-creating and co-authoring with God and each other to create the kind of world that will bring justice to many. In biblical stories, in hearing Isaiah's core story, in hearing the stories of those in our communities, we find ourselves in every telling and retelling. In sharing our stories, we encounter the holy, the overflowing glory of God. We deepen our relationship with God, our understanding and knowing of God, and how she is moving in our lives. Just as Isaiah heard the voice of God say to him, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" The voice of God is calling us today. What is it calling you into? What is it calling us into? Will you go? Will we go? Here I am. Send me. Amen.